Assuming I had that little fake title card in the right place before it flopped, after I unflopped it. It says, and you were able to read, a thoroughly amateur production. As you have seen already, this is thoroughly amateur. I don't have any fancy production facilities. I don't have teleprompters. All I have is my webcam on my laptop and me. But then Whiskey for Beginners is a beginner's whiskey channel, and so maybe being thoroughly amateur isn't entirely bad. This episode is What is Whiskey? I didn't know that hardly when I started drinking whiskey 16 months ago. I knew there was such a thing as whiskey. I knew you distilled it, and I knew I didn't like it, or I thought I didn't. I didn't really know what good whiskey tasted like. And I suspect a lot of people out there who are just starting whiskey or thinking about starting to drink whiskey don't know much, if any, more than I did then. Whiskey, then, is an alcoholic beverage distilled from a mash made of grain. And at some point as we go along, probably not in this video, I hope to define some of those terms. Mash, distilled. Grain, hopefully, is fairly obvious as to what it is. But whiskey is just that basic. It's several hundred years old. I haven't looked up dates or anything. Distillation is about 2,000 years old. Distillation of alcohol is newer than that. Distillation of whiskey, there are people who argue about it. I prefer to think it started in Ireland and Scotland more or less about the same time. The first mention of whiskey is in an Irish document, 1400 something, if I remember correctly. But the original whiskey that they made was what today we would call White Dog. It wasn't aged. They just distilled the mash and took the pure, clear alcohol off the still and drank that. And that can be good. I've had some Buffalo Trace White Dog off their #1 mash bill, and it's not as complex as aged whiskey. And there are things that I'm going to get into in later videos, so don't worry if you don't understand the terms. It wasn't as complex as aged whiskey, but there were flavors in there, good flavors. You can distill it so it's such a high proof that it's basically just vodka, no flavor to it at all. But that's what whiskey is, grain distilled into alcohol. Legally, that's not all there is to whiskey. In the United States, you can't call it whiskey if it's under 80 proof. You can't call it bourbon whiskey unless it's spent some time in an oak barrel. But whiskey itself is really very simple. Let me had the TV on pause. It decided it wanted to unpause. Early amateur productions, right? There are laws in Ireland and Scotland and the United States and Canada, wherever they make whiskey, that regulate what you can call whiskey, what you have to do to make it, how you have to store it, that kind of thing. George Washington was one of the largest whiskey producers in the country after he left the White House. Well, the White House didn't exist in his day. They were building it. But after he was president. And what he made would not today legally be rye whiskey. In his day, it was rye whiskey. So the very basics of whiskey are what matter here. what they call moonshine, illegal whiskey, although now they're putting that term on legal stuff that's just not aged, is just the basic whiskey that they used to make in the hills of Ireland and the highlands of Scotland. And you know, if that's what you like, you can drink it, not a problem. As far as I'm concerned, that's whiskey. But you've got that, the White Dog, moonshine, unaged whiskey, whatever you want to call it. There's bourbon whiskey, which you can only make in the United States. Rye whiskey, which comes from rye. We'll go into mash bills and such in another video, and details of the type of whiskey. Scotch whiskey, which is Scottish whiskey. Scotch is an English term. The people of Scotland never called themselves Scotch, but it's become the accepted term for Scottish whiskey. There's Irish whiskey. They make whiskey in Australia, in Japan, in Germany, in England, various places. The major kinds, though, are bourbon, rye, Scotch, and Irish. And Canadian whiskey, which they'll sometimes call rye whiskey, even if it's not rye whiskey by the American definition. And whiskey these days, you're going to find, is a brown liquor. Bourbon, in fact, they started first, that before it became bourbon, they'd call it red liquor because of the color it got from the barrel. As I said, it comes off the still white, or transparent, actually. It seems to me that it's even clearer than clear water. Then it goes into a barrel and ages for some period, however long it may be. Scottish whiskey, you might find it aged 30, 40. I think they've sold some 60-year whiskey. Here in the United States, with a warmer climate and greater temperature variations, 20 years or so is a high age. Different places in the United States, say Texas, 10 years would be a high-aged whiskey. I don't even know if they sell any 10-year whiskey from Texas. But it ages, and that's where the color comes from, and a lot of the flavor comes from. You can make whiskey from different grains: wheat, corn, rye, barley, rice. You can make whiskey from rice. Anything that's a grain, you can make whiskey from, although some grains, rice and oats, for instance, are not very common at all. That pretty much wraps up what is whiskey. As I say, we'll get to the details, the different types of whiskey, how they make it, what aging is, and all that in another video.